First of all, thank you for coming to this session. I'm wondering if some of you, when you first saw this, Lessons Learned Syrian Refugee, you thought, oh no, haven't we done this before? In fact, hasn't she spoken about it before? And you're really putting in at 3:15 on a Friday afternoon. So thank you for coming. But in so many ways, this was such a unique situation where governments, government departments, community sponsorship groups, settlement service providers, ordinary Canadians, we came together. There was an unprecedented mobilization of resources in a really short space of time to respond to the rapid arrival and settlement of the Syrian refugees. Such a unique situation, I suspect. We could all come back next year and would have more to say about what happened and what we learned. And every one of us knows that it's not something we can put a check beside. Researchers will be looking at this movement of peoples for years and years to come. Governments are looking at it now with a view of what will we do next time, and also what can we do now to better integrate the Syrian refugees. And service providers and communities, what are we doing? Well, every day across the country, we're still in the middle of pulling together resources, partnerships, programs, and services to respond to the complex needs of the huge numbers of Syrian clients, but not only Syrians, all refugees. We all know what happened, as the former panel just told us. The pictures came out. And the Liberal Party said we're going to take 25,000 by the end of the year. We will never be able to hear that again without thinking of what Stephanie just told us about. And we stood up as a community, as a settlement community, and said, we got this, we can do this, and we never faltered. And so what are we doing differently? What changes have we made? Well, in the next few minutes, brief minutes, I can't do much except give you some of my reflections on what changes have made. My comments come from a RAP provider, Resettlement Assistance Program provider, and the largest settlement providing organization in Atlantic Canada, from a region or province that punched way, way above its weight in terms of numbers in the welcoming of both government-assisted and privately sponsored refugees into our region. So, from a national federal perspective, what did we learn? Well, first of all, we learned that our shared history meant that the settlement sector and the federal government could work in true partnership, recognizing each other's unique role. That we could have an open and honest dialogue that benefited all of us. That when you build trust, you build capacity. When you build capacity, you can develop solutions for complex problems. The settlement sector was there when the federal government called, and the federal government was there when we responded. Although I recognize this was a unique situation and processes and guidelines precluded this from continuing, I have to say that across the country, we missed some of that spirit of collaboration with the federal government. We recognize the Syrian Refugee Program was a moment in time, but I think there's still a great potential for us to reap the benefits of increased openness and dialogue. We learned that funding flow to settlement providing organizations is a crucial element. It needs to flow earlier so we can hire and train people, and it needs to be ongoing. Certainly in some regions of the country, these constant Syria amendments so late in the year are killing us, and they're not providing the benefit to clients that they could be. It's not that the funding is not needed, it's desperately needed, but hiring staff, orienting, training for 5 months is crazy making. We learned that the status quo for refugee resettlement wasn't okay. The Syrian movement shone a light on the RAP program, on income assistance rates, travel loans, idiosyncrasies of IFHP, and on immigration processing procedures. The refugee program needed review, and we witnessed and welcomed some significant changes in all these areas. We also know that the light needs to continue to shine and more work needs to be done. Just heard today that in Quebec, the 1-year support of government assisted refugees in Quebec is now for 2 years. At the time of the Syrian movement, we were so glad that IFHP was in place. We couldn't have done it without, as well as the travel loan exemptions, but we still had to work with clients for whom this wasn't the case. This inequity caused us many, many problems, and we need to consider the impact on all refugees when we start developing these programs and initiatives. For our part, we in the sector learned we needed to rethink and change some of our procedures to accommodate larger numbers. And indeed, larger family size and larger numbers weren't the same thing. and both brought unique challenges and opportunities to do things differently. We learned that the processes that we had in place were great, but they may not be and the content we had was great, but we had to change to be able to accommodate these large numbers. We learned we needed to identify the leaders in the community really quickly. We needed to use local ethnic and faith community more intentionally to prepare the community and to repeat information multiple times. And we needed to develop alternative language, employment, different approaches to be able to accommodate the unique needs of this group of refugees. We learned we can't ignore our role in facilitating family reunification of resettled refugees who have members of their families still abroad in refugee situations. We haven't addressed this, and many of us are already beginning to see its impact, but in the years to come, we know that family reunification, delayed family reunification, is going to become a serious challenge to refugee settlement and integration, and we need to respond. For those of you who are sponsorship agreement holders, we need to come together to build a network of support and communication. We learned that when we bring in large numbers of refugees at one time, their profile, their education, their ability to speak French or English, their family size, has an incredibly significant impact on the scope of services they need and for how long. We always knew this to be true, but it was exacerbated by the numbers of Syrians. And with this recognition, every service provider in this room knows that with the ending of the supplemental Syrian funding from IRCC next year, we'll be faced with serious challenges. As we develop innovative programming services to meet these needs of this cohort of refugees, we're all still trying to catch up, reduce wait lists, respond to crises, meet the needs that we knew from day one with this profile 3 years wasn't going to be long enough. And also what seemed like overnight, with the assistance of IRCC, other federal government departments learned and recognized their role, not just in supporting the Syrian refugees to settle, but also in supporting all newcomers who are just that, new, with all the rights of any other resident in Canada. And with that recognition, we've seen many new programs and services established with funding that is not from IRCC, most of whom know that this has to continue with the increase in refugee numbers in the next few years. And the provinces, the municipal governments, again, we learned that we could work with them. I think many of us previously had great relationships with our provincial government partners, but certainly for us in the Atlantic, refugees were not in their purview. Quite honestly, for the most part in Nova Scotia, refugees meant referral to ISANS. I remember for many people, it was replicated across the country. The first meeting we invited to of mostly deputy ministers and senior provincial officials, hosted by the Emergency Management Office. They'd already had one meeting, and now we, the RAP and settlement provider, were called in. As we told them, this isn't an emergency. We showed them the GAR pathway, what we did, how we did it, how we could ramp this up from 180 in 1 year to 1,500 in 3 months. There was a collective sigh of relief. We had it, and they let us have it. With this, our credibility and reputation just increased many-fold. Many of us gained a significant level of respect that had previously been overlooked right across the country. And for the most part, those relationships have flourished to establish many inclusive services and programs for all refugees, and where relevant, all newcomers. So in the provinces and across the departments, they too learned that they had a role to play. And again, not just with the Syrian refugee movement, key departments within the Nova Scotia Health Authority, mental health, emergency, family physicians, clinics, specialized health departments met monthly to address challenges, and those meetings have continued to take place. Department of Community Services in Nova Scotia, responsible for provincial income, suddenly hired Arabic speakers to respond to their client base. I'm sure that in many parts of the country you think, well, we've been doing this for years. This was very significant for us in Nova Scotia. Municipal governments stepped up and learned they had a role to play with refugee resettlement. In the case of Halifax, providing 1 year's bus pass and 1 year free recreation. What's happened in the last couple of weeks is that Halifax Council has also approved the expansion of this to cover all refugee claimants. Things have started to change. Government departments learned, recognized interpretation was key to inclusive service delivery, that they could work in partnership with us as the service provider, and that we both had expertise that we could share. But the responsibility for interpretation was theirs. It wasn't ISAN's. And in the community organizations, those that supported people with disabilities, family resource centers, began to see our clients as their clients. We as a sector have been saying for years, refugees come to Canada via refugee program. Refugees are a vulnerable group like many other vulnerable groups in our community. But they're residents, they're just like anybody else. They have unique needs because of their experiences, but they're Canadian residents. And as such, organizations, government departments, community groups, schools, universities, work placements, they need to look through this lens when they're developing their plans. Because it's the right thing to do, and what's the change is that this is beginning to take place. And the workplace, while some employers step forward and learn that they too had a role to play, we know we still have a long way to go, but the skill shortage is beginning to hurt employers. And there are many exciting initiatives from coast to coast attaching the Syrian refugees to the workforce, recognizing that perhaps the workplace is also a good place to learn language. We have a lot still to learn and a lot to teach. When are people ready for the workforce? What do they need to get ready? How much English do you need? What support do you need post-employment? How do we prepare the workforce for welcoming refugees? What needs to be in place before people attach? This is where many of us as settlement providing organizations are right now, battling with these questions, but they're great questions to battle with. And even in the questioning, it's a mammoth step forward. We learned that corporate Canada can play a role in refugee settlement. In Nova Scotia, for example, in providing a building for all the donations. These sorts of things were taking place right across the country. But what we need to make sure is that some of the things that the contributions, sorry, that's the word I'm looking for, the contributions of corporate Canada are relevant, that we don't get 1,000 toques that don't fit anybody, that we don't have books that nobody ever wants to read, that you don't need in your storage rooms. So the CN Housing Supplement was an outstanding example of putting money where the need was. And we need to get a whole lot better at it in the sector, at being proactive, building strong relationships with corporate Canada, working with them for what is needed, and not wait for the next disaster. And community groups, the role of the community went up 100 notches with the Syrian Refugee Program, the huge outpouring of support of volunteers. Through them, we witnessed Canada at its best. But managing that support, those expectations, was a mammoth task, and one we didn't anticipate. There were many people who wanted to do our work and thought they could do it so much better than we could. In the sector, I think we all know volunteers are a critical piece of the jigsaw in supports for refugee settlement. But what we learned was the need for much more training, support, coordination, and in the future we need to focus on this huge resource even before day one. Most of us in the sector are doing that now. Other groups in the community are also essential. The existing ethnic faith groups, in this case the Syrian community and the mosques. Lessons learned, stronger connections and links, in fact ongoing links with multicultural and faith groups. We can't wait until the next disaster. And then we come to the PSR groups, private sponsorship groups. Before the Syrian Refugee Initiative, we received around 40 or so privately sponsored refugees each year into Nova Scotia. Nearly all were family sponsored and with the support of community or faith groups. Suddenly we're expecting around 500 privately sponsored and blended, around half of those outside Halifax. The groups were committed, diverse, well-intentioned, but for the most part had little to no experience of the refugee experience or refugee settlement. And what did we learn? That although the PSO program has incredible potential, sponsorship groups need significant initial and ongoing support and guidance. The Canadian PSR program has been viewed by other countries as a model for refugee resettlement, and it has some incredible benefits. The links to community, you know what they are, the social support. But every RAP provider in this country, and indeed most other settlement providing organization, will tell you that the lesson learned is that this doesn't happen because it looks good on paper. We need to invest much more in the PSR program to support the groups and indeed recognize our joint role in supporting the refugees. In addition, there needs to be some significant changes if we want to encourage and maximise the potential of this example of Canadian generosity, not least review the cap system that limits sponsorship. Another thing we learned is the potential of these groups to push for change. Many of these groups included wonderful, articulate, well-positioned people who had contacts and influence. Suddenly, they were faced with issues they'd never faced before: affordable housing, poverty, use of food banks, social assistance rates, access to government services. We know we have a band of supporters out there who are ready to take on some of these systemic issues, facing both refugees and their neighbours. I don't think we've yet capitalised on this, but many of us are partners in bringing the social service sector together with the community to work on them. And we also learned the importance and impact that communication has, and let's face it, miscommunication has. Knowledge is power. The more information you have, the better decisions you can make. We all need as much information and as early as possible about the profiles of the refugees. The interest by my media was unprecedented and unrelenting. We soon learned that in mass movements like this, we needed dedicated communication people, and we needed the community on our side. In terms of communication with the refugees, we soon learned that most of the refugees were in communication with each other, locally and across the country and across the world, through apps on their phones. I think lesson learned here is that we need to clue into this so much earlier and develop strategies to use technology much more effectively. And us as a settlement sector, again, I'm very much speaking from the organisation I work for. Honestly, first of all, it affirmed that we as a sector are miracle workers. I make no apology for patting ourselves on the back for this one. You did not have a roadmap. We didn't know how many, where they would be coming, how many children, how sick would they, but we formed partnerships, we talked to everybody we could, and then we put our heads down and we got on with the work. Work that we've been doing invisibly but successfully most for the past 30, 40 years. As a sector, we learned we need to support each other. In the Atlantic, we knew that other RAP providers were only a phone call away, and we always answered the phone to each other. So moving forward, we need to recognize the value of the networks, the value of the umbrella associations to influence service delivery. I think the sharing of ideas, tools, resources across the country, we could have done much better on that, but there wasn't any time and no structure or resources in place for us to do it. I think we learned that in terms of refugee resettlement, empowerment is the key. Certainly at ISANS, we always knew this to be true, but now we need to be more intentional so that clients can advocate for themselves. There are some who still say, can't speak English, therefore they can't do anything. We'll do it for them. We got to move so far away from this. Our job is to integrate clients into the community. That doesn't mean to do things for them. It means that we help them to do things for themselves so that they become strong, independent members and contributors to the community. Refugees are strong, resilient, and capable. They've survived situations that would put most of us under. We need to build on their strengths. In terms of the language of the Syrians, let's face it, we were really fortunate. There were many Arabic speakers in our community who we could employ and also use. But as we look at the Yazidi and the Rohingya populations in some communities, we need to be really, really mindful and be really proactive on this. We soon learned a lot more about the limited number of housing units. We found a lot more about housing than we ever knew that we could. Especially with that could accommodate large families and people with disabilities. The Canadian rental market isn't set up for large families, so many of us are developing stronger relationships and partnerships with landlords and property managers. We already knew that we have to start where people are, and we soon learned that with large numbers we could, and needed to develop strong and extensive partnerships and innovative strategies for language learning, for workforce attachment, for community integration. And I think we learned we need to be much more intentional in using the talents and skills of the refugees as early as possible. We had no option in this case because of the large numbers, but identifying the leaders, their abilities, their willingness, and indeed their desire to help. We were able to, and we can in the future, capitalize on an often overlooked but incredibly critical resource. So in conclusion, I think simply put, it takes a village, and what I think has changed is that the village is now receptive. Government departments, communities, community organizations, individuals, Canadians, they're much more prepared. The demographic tsunami that is facing many provinces had somewhat of a reprieve in 2016 with the Syrian refugees, who were responsible for many of the provinces having the largest number of immigrants for 50 or so years. Through them, we have 49,000 new residents, more than half of them children, with nearly every family wanting to bring family members. We know it's a huge opportunity for Canada, for the provinces, for smaller communities, but only if we do this next stage well. Perhaps the greatest lesson learned is not one we learned from the Syrian movement, but one we in the sector know from 40 years of working with refugees. If we want this to work, if we want to maintain our reputation as the leader in refugee resettlement across the world, if we want refugees to maximize their potential, thereby contributing to the community and economy, investment in refugee integration is key. And that investment can't be based on how long do we think it's going to take, but on how long it actually is going to take.